On September 17, 1971, a 17-year-old girl disappeared without a trace in the state of Iowa. When her body was found in the woods on the trunk of an abandoned car, it told a horrifying story. Half naked, with signs of violence, she became the victim of a cruel murderer. The police had 3 suspects: an obsessively friendly man who offered to help her, her old friend who suddenly found himself in a psychiatric hospital after the body was found, and her husband's former cellmate with her photo in his wallet. It took 50 years to find out the truth about who took the life of young Maureen Farley. Cedar Rapids is known as the city of 5 seasons and is considered one of the safest places in the Midwest. Therefore, the news that a dead girl was found in the forest came as a real shock to the locals. From the very beginning of the investigation, it became obvious that finding the killer would not be easy. However, despite all the difficulties, one small clue became a key factor in the fight for justice. Around 6:40 p.m., the Cedar Rapids police station received a call. The woman on the line reported that her teenage son, along with a friend, were walking along a forest road and noticed something strange among the trees. They were hunting for squirrels and at some point saw a woman. When the teenagers got closer, they realized that on the back of a wrecked car lay the lifeless body of a girl. She was partially undressed and some time had passed since her death. The teenagers were very frightened and shocked by this terrible find. They did not waste time and ran home for help. A few minutes later, police officer Roland Ecke received information about the terrible discovery over the radio. He and his partner were in a patrol car when a call came in from a dispatcher asking them to check River Road, where 2 boys had found a dead woman on the trunk of a car. The patrol officers drove about 50 meters deep into the forest, where the body was found. The first thing they noticed was that the car had been in the woods much longer than the victim. It was abandoned and weeds had already grown up to the roof. Despite the fact that the teenagers accurately described their terrible discovery, the police officers could hardly believe what they saw. The girl's body was lying on the hood of the car. Her skin was colorless, and it was obvious that she had been there for quite a long time. Roland carefully examined the area around the car and along the road, but could not find any traces of people or wheels. Then he called for reinforcement. When the investigators arrived at the scene, they immediately realized that this was a crime scene. Carefully examining the car, they found an important clue that helped shed light on what had happened. In particular, it became obvious that the girl did not end up in this forest of her own free will. She was not wearing shoes or socks, and her feet were absolutely clean. This indicated that someone had brought her here. The police were sure that the victim was already dead when her body was discovered on the car. The condition of the girl's clothing confirmed their assumption about the nature of the crime. She was wearing a sweater, her shirt was pulled up high without a halter top, and her jeans were pulled down below her hips. Her half-off clothing indicated a possible rape. Investigators estimated the girl's age to be between 16 and 21. On her right hand, she wore a friendship ring, and on her left, a wedding and engagement ring. According to the police, the body had been in the forest for at least 5 days, and possibly longer. Given the conditions in which the body was found, it was in good condition. Near the body, experts did not find any documents or traces indicating the cause of the girl's death. However, experienced investigators suggested that there was only one reason why the body could be hidden in the forest. It was an attempt to conceal a murder. The place where the body was found was secluded. It was located outside Cedar Rapids on Gravina Road. Obviously, someone wanted to hide traces of the crime and get rid of the body so that it would not be found. A kilometer from this place was the city dump, so cars rarely drove along the road. While experts examined the crime scene in search of new evidence, the main questions remained unanswered. What was the victim's name, and who wanted her dead? Investigators in Cedar Rapids eagerly awaited the coroner's findings in the case of the girl found dead in the nearby woods. The doctor determined that the cause of death was cerebral hemorrhage from a blow to the head. According to the expert, the victim lost consciousness from the first blow, and the lack of timely medical care led to a fatal outcome. The doctor believes that the perpetrator, having inflicted the injury on her, hoped that she would regain consciousness. However, when he realized that she was dead, he decided to get rid of her body in order to hide traces of the crime. According to the coroner's report, the victim had been dead for about a week before she was found. Also, the suspicions of the investigators who worked at the crime scene were confirmed. Evidence was found that the girl had been raped. The evidence pointed to a heartbreaking story of a slow and painful death. However, in order to bring the perpetrator to justice, it was necessary to establish the identity of the victim. Investigators began to carefully study recent missing persons cases. It turned out that a week ago, the police received a statement that a girl named Maureen Farley had disappeared. According to the descriptions of her appearance and tattoos on her arm, it was possible to establish that the body found in the forest belonged to her. The girl's age of 17 years and the date of disappearance also coincided with the coroner's conclusions. According to the statement, Maureen's manager from the local diner was the first to contact the police. She became alarmed when the girl did not show up for her third shift. According to the manager, Maureen could always be relied upon. She was never late and always warned if she was not going to come to work. When Maureen did not show up, the manager went to look for her in the dormitory. In the girl's apartment, she did not find anything criminal, but she noticed an alarming detail. Maureen's work uniform was not in the closet. Maureen was a waitress at Ade's Cafe and Diner. Everyone knew her as a responsible and hardworking employee. According to investigators, the last time she was seen at work was on Friday morning, September 17th, when she finished her night shift. On September 20th, the manager called the police and reported Maureen missing. The girl's friend said that she had recently moved to the area from Sioux City, and the reason why she moved interested the investigators. They found out that Maureen Farley got married early. Shortly after the wedding, her husband was sent to prison. The prison where her husband David was serving his sentence was located near Cedar Rapids. Maureen rented a room in a local dormitory and got a job to provide for herself. She worked as a waitress in Cedar Rapids and had the opportunity to visit her husband frequently. She usually came to see him almost every week. However, that weekend Maureen did not visit the prison. She was supposed to meet her husband and go to church on Sunday, but she didn't show up and disappeared without a trace. No one saw her again. According to the chronology of events, Maureen was attacked between the time she left work on Friday morning and her return in the evening of the same day. During the investigation into her disappearance, Cedar Rapids police sent officers to Sioux City to talk to Maureen's mother. This turned out to be an extremely important step. The woman was very worried about her daughter's safety. She was sure that something had happened because Maureen could not just disappear. For days later, the same officers told Mary that her daughter was dead. It was terrible. Mary knew something bad had happened, but when she heard that they had found her daughter's body, she simply lost her speech. The emotions experienced by Maureen's relatives were especially acute because they remembered what she was like. The girl was the pride of the Brubaker family, the first child and the eldest of 7 children. Maureen grew up to be a smart, cheerful, and responsible girl. She was born on July 4th, and according to her mother, this was reflected in her character. The girl was bright, like fireworks, always ahead of her time. She was in a hurry to grow up. Maureen loved all her brothers and sisters, but she was especially close to her younger sister Lisa. The girl took her everywhere with her. The responsibility that Maureen took on made her grow up early. She met and fell in love with David Farley as a teenager. She was 15 and David was 16 when they got married. It was crazy love. David was from a good family, and Maureen loved him very much. But their vow to live long and happily was broken when David was caught passing bad checks. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison. Maureen's decision to move to Cedar Rapids for him led to her mysterious murder. Investigators were dealing with only a few clues obtained during the autopsy and examination of the scene after the violence was committed. It was very little. Even the biological samples taken during the autopsy were not of much value before the advent of DNA testing. Investigators realized that detective work would become a key aspect in this case. They understood that they needed to follow Maureen's movements before she encountered the killer. First of all, they conducted a thorough search of her room. The police found a diary and red letters, but did not find anything that might catch their attention. Judging by the entries, Maureen was an idealistic teenager who was struggling to make ends meet. Nothing was missing from her room except her work uniform. Investigators interviewed neighbors to find out what they remembered about that fateful day. The answers obtained became the first clue for the police. The dormitory manager said that she heard voices in Maureen's room. According to her, the voices sounded calm, and she did not suspect anything suspicious. She only noted that one of the voices was low. The manager drew attention to another important aspect. The room had a strong smell of tobacco smoke, which had a sweet tinge. The manager did not see the man, but she remembered the exact time. Afternoon, on September 17th. It was the day of Maureen's disappearance. Then the investigators tried to find witnesses who could have seen Maureen after the manager heard her talking to a man. However, efforts proved futile. No one saw her or came into contact with her. Maureen's family was at a loss. Who could be the smoker, or who could be considered a suspect? They said that everyone loved her, she had no enemies, and she never talked about quarrels. She got along well with people. They were completely unaware of who could have committed her murder. In the end, one of Maureen's colleagues helped advance the investigation, which had come to a standstill. The girl told her about her plans for Friday evening. She had a scheduled meeting with an old friend from Sioux City who promised to take her somewhere, but did not specify where exactly. This man's name was Bobby Moore, and he became the first suspect in the case. The police found out that he had a difficult past, including several arrests. They understood that it was necessary to thoroughly check him out. Maureen's husband, David, asked her not to communicate with Moore. He knew that Bobby had been accused of domestic violence against several women. He warned his wife, "Be careful, he beats women." During the investigation, other important details became known. One of Maureen's girlfriends said that shortly after her disappearance, she saw Bobby Moore in Cedar Rapids. He claimed that he came to town to help search for his friend. The investigators had questions for Bobby Moore, and they were alarmed when they tried to find him. It turned out that on the day Maureen's body was found, Moore voluntarily admitted himself to a psychiatric hospital in Sioux City. Investigators speculated that he might be tormented by guilt. In their opinion, this was the reason why he went to the hospital. They believed that he was guilty of her death. But if Moore thought that the hospital staff would be able to shield him from the murder investigation, he was wrong. When he was informed of Maureen's death, he stated that he had nothing to do with it. According to him, he considered her his sister and was not involved in her disappearance. According to his alibi, at that time he was in Sioux City. Moore was expecting a lie detector test. To the surprise of the police, he successfully passed the test. Investigators were unable to find any clear evidence that Bobby Moore was in any way involved in her murder. However, it was not possible to acquit the man either. He remained under suspicion in the murder of Maureen Farley. But soon another person came under the sight of the investigators. During the investigation of Maureen's murder, investigators continued to carefully gather information about all the men that the 17-year-old girl communicated with during the 3 weeks of Cedar Rapids. Soon one name took first place on the list of suspects: Gary Castle. Who was Gary Castle, and how did he end up in the police's field of vision? The fact is that he was David Farley's cellmate. They met Maureen during her visits with her husband. David was still behind bars when Gary was released shortly before Maureen disappeared. While talking to the man, investigators examined his personal belongings and were unpleasantly shocked by what they found. Maureen Farley's photo was in his wallet. Why does a man need her photo, and what is the connection between them? Investigators were looking forward to answers to these questions. They assumed that he became infatuated with her during her visits to her husband in prison and wanted to check this version. They compiled a chronology of Gary's movements from the time of his release from prison until the evening Maureen disappeared. There were serious suspicions that she liked him, and he began to stalk her. In the interrogation room, investigators pressured Gary Castle. When asked about Maureen's murder, he began to deny his involvement. The man said that on September 18th, he was not near Cedar Rapids, and he could prove it. He really managed to provide an alibi and confirm his whereabouts that day. Then the police returned to Maureen's room to find evidence that Gary was there on the morning when the manager heard a man. However, investigators were unable to establish any connection between Gary and Maureen's murder. There were no signs that he was involved in this crime. Although Castle was unable to explain why Maureen's photo was in his wallet, this promising clue did not lead to the case being solved. After that, investigators returned to the diner where Maureen worked and again interrogated her colleagues and visitors. Their efforts were not in vain. They received valuable information. One of the regular visitors named George said that at the time Maureen disappeared, he saw her with a man who, according to him, looked like a hippie. Investigators asked the girl's relatives if they knew a person who fit the description. However, Maureen's husband David immediately told the police that they should interrogate George himself. When the police studied George's past, they understood why David Farley treated him with suspicion. The man told Maureen that his acquaintances could get her husband out of prison. However, was this offer sincere, or did he just want to get close to the girl? He knew about her problems and offered his help in repairing the car. However, the police suspected that this suggestion had a hidden motive. There was a significant age difference between them. He was 52 years old, and she was only 17. The question arises, what could such a man need from a young girl? George told the police that during a late-night conversation with the young waitress, he offered her his help. He was touched by the situation in which the girl found herself, experiencing both emotional and material difficulties. Investigators did not believe him and asked where he was the night Maureen disappeared. He replied that at that time he was at work. The police made an inquiry and found out that he really worked at the Cedar Rapids bus depot from 1 p.m. to 9 p.m. The investigators' calculations showed that George's working hours excluded his involvement in Maureen's murder. They had to look for new clues. However, after checking all the versions, they had no evidence left. And by 72, the case was closed. The police identified all the suspects, but each of them had an alibi. For Maureen's family, the lack of improvement was another difficult test in a series of constant emotional suffering. They did not know where to find the strength to cope with this tragedy. Maureen's death was a huge blow to her mother. She was left alone with 6 children, and every morning she had to get up and take care of them. It all had a big impact on their family. Perhaps it was this pain that prompted Lisa, Maureen's sister, to choose a career in law enforcement. For many years, she used her position to remind Cedar Rapids colleagues of how the unsolved case had affected her and her family. A festering wound remained in their hearts. They wanted to know who did it. Why would someone kill Maureen? For more than 3 decades, the Maureen Farley case policed the Cedar Rapids Police Department. However, in 2006, a new investigator joined the investigation and found unprocessed DNA samples. He took DNA samples collected from the victim's body and sent them to a laboratory for analysis. The results were promising. In the course of laboratory research, an expert was able to compile a DNA profile of a man. Investigators were confident that new evidence and modern DNA analysis would help them track down Maureen's killer. However, when they compared the DNA profile with the database, they did not find a single match. Because of this failure, the investigation dragged on for another 9 years. In 2015, investigator Matt Denlinger studied the case files and compiled a list of 75 names that appeared in the initial investigation. He was serious and intended to take DNA samples from each of the suspects. This process turned out to be long and monotonous. The investigator needed to find each suspect, take a DNA sample from him, and wait for the results. The process of eliminating many names could take years. Therefore, he involved retired Lieutenant Ken Ashburn and former intelligence agent J.D. Smith in this large-scale work. The team focused on the names at the beginning of Denlinger's long list. In particular, on 2 suspects that the investigators of the 70s were dealing with. They were able to find Bobby Moore and took a DNA sample from him. After that, he was excluded from the list. However, when Harry Castle's DNA also did not match the profile, the investigation hit another dead end. Then in 2018, with the help of a new type of testing, the Golden State Killer was found. A Cedar Rapids teacher hoped that this method would be useful in their work as well. This is about forensic genealogy, a new technique that has already demonstrated its effectiveness. Investigators were confident that it would help them in solving this case. But unfortunately, when they sent the sample to the company, they were told that it was badly damaged. The investigators were disappointed, but did not give up and continued to carefully compare the samples. The team resumed the investigation again, and the first thing they noticed was the person who aroused suspicion among the first investigators, George Smith, the friendly diner visitor. However, when they began to check his biography, they discovered that Mr. Smith had never had a DNA sample taken. Investigators delved into George Smith's history and found out that he died in 2013 at the age of 94. His friends and loved ones wrote a touching obituary about the beloved Cedar Rapids businessman. One phrase said that George could always be recognized by the sweet tobacco smoke. This phrase, and a photograph of an elderly George caught the attention of investigator J.D. Smith. He recalled that the dormitory manager smelled sweet cigar smoke near Maureen's room on the day she went missing. He read it and immediately realized that this man was in her room. It also meant that George Smith had lied about his shift at the bus depot on Friday afternoon. Now for the team of investigators. He became the main suspect in the murder of Maureen. He was too friendly. The 70s investigators treated him with suspicion. Now the police had to find out if he was involved in this crime. Investigators thoroughly studied all the details of George Smith's life in 1971. Earlier that same year, he divorced his wife. At the time of Maureen's murder, Smith lived just a few blocks from her dormitory. He could have known where she lived and easily come to her. In addition, Smith worked part-time as a garbage collector, and thanks to his work, he was familiar with the road to the landfill, where Maureen's body was later found. Investigators were going to conduct an exhumation to take a sample of his DNA. However, at the funeral home, they were told that the body had been cremated. It is impossible to isolate DNA from cremated remains. They hit another dead end. Denlinger decided to act differently. He was going through options and wondered what if he took a sample from one of his children. Matt located George Smith's daughter and obtained a sample of her DNA. He sent it to the laboratory and waited for the result. On September 24, 2021, exactly 50 years after Maureen's body was found, the DNA comparison results came in. It turned out that George Smith was indeed the killer of the 17-year-old girl. The date when the results came in did not seem like just a coincidence to the command. It had been exactly 50 years. It was difficult for the investigators to comprehend all this, as well as for Maureen's family, when they were told the news that they had not been waiting for 5 decades. Matt Denlinger still remembers how he called Maureen's sister. He will never forget how emotionally Lisa took this news. Then she amazed him by saying, "My mom is next to me. Tell her." Matt Denlinger lost his speech because he did not think that Maureen's mother was still alive. It was such moments that once convinced Matt and his team to become police officers. He was glad to tell the woman that they had found her daughter's killer, even though 50 years had already passed. Maureen's family was immensely grateful to the investigators who did not give up and solve this crime. It was an extraordinary moment. Victory. Good over evil. No one knows what happened on the day George Smith killed Maureen Farley. However, the evidence allowed investigators to put forward their version. In their opinion, George probably convinced Maureen to come to his house under the pretext of some kind of help. For example, with a lawyer or a car. And when she came, George decided that he wanted to have intimate closeness with her. But Maureen rejected Smith's courtship, and the situation escalated. Something went wrong. He hit her head. Either he hit her on the head and then raped her, and only after that he realized that she was dead. Most likely, Smith kept Maureen's body at his home until nightfall. In the dark, he loaded the body into the car and drove to a remote forested area. According to the investigators, George brought the body in his car. Then he got out of the car. He carried the body to the enemy, where an old car was left in the forest. He put the body on the trunk of this car and left. Although Maureen's family was grateful for the answers they received, the completion of the case opened old wounds and prompted memories that they had been trying to forget for many years. Unfortunately, not all of her relatives were able to find out what happened and who was the culprit. 2 of her brothers and her father had already passed away without knowing the terrible truth. Investigators hope that solving a half-century-old murder carries 2 messages. Victims' families should not give up, and murderers should remember that justice does not sleep. You know, when I delve into cases like the story of Maureen Farley, I'm always struck by one thing: criminals almost never look like criminals. In mass culture, they are often portrayed as gloomy loners with a crazy look. But reality is far more terrifying. They walk among us, smile, and seem like ordinary people. George Smith was a successful businessman, a respected person in the city. He was loved and respected. And only after 50 years did the world learn about his true face. We live in an era when criminals have become even more sophisticated. They study psychology, know how to manipulate, how to inspire trust. They can spend months building a strategy, gaining trust. And the most terrible thing is that they know our weaknesses. They know that a lonely person is more likely to believe in sincerity and kindness. that someone who needs help rarely suspects the one who offers this help. But there is also good news. Criminals still leave traces. No matter how technologies develop, no matter how sophisticated methods of concealing crimes become, the truth still comes to the surface. It just sometimes takes time, and the DNA test of George Smith's daughter is a vivid proof of this. I often think about what Maureen's family felt all these years. To live half a century with an open wound, not knowing the truth, and then find out that the killer had been living an ordinary life all this time, died in the circle of loved ones, without ever answering for his crime. This makes us think about justice, about time, about the fact that some wounds never heal. But there is also a ray of hope in this story. Crimes do not go unpunished. Sooner or later the truth comes to the surface. And if today somewhere there is another Maureen who feels danger, but is afraid to trust her intuition, let this story give her the strength to listen to her inner voice. This was Detective Brooks. If you care about similar stories, subscribe to the Detective Brooks Stories channel. Ahead there are many more intricate cases that make us think about the nature of evil and teach us to be more vigilant. Take care of yourself.